Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Brad Snyder to the show. Welcome, Brad. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we appreciate it. We appreciate it. Brad Snyder is a law professor at the prestigious Georgetown University. Which class do you teach down there, sir?
I teach constitutional law. I teach constitutional history, and I also teach a class on sports law.
He is also the author of 2006 book, A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports. Now, Mr. Snyder, when I made it a point to get a better understanding of sports history, this is one of the first books I picked up. Throughout the years, I've always heard that Curt Flood was a pivotal part of there being free agency in sports. So that was a story I definitely needed to learn. Let's give the audience a little backstory. Curt Flood was an outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, and in 1969 he was traded, and he didn't want to report. You know, he wanted to challenge, I guess, the rules of baseball. So first I would ask if you can help us get an understanding of the reserve clause and, I guess, the baseball landscape before Curt Flood challenged it.
Yeah, it's hard for people to get their heads around the idea of professional sports without free agency,
Without
right?
question.
And there was a clause in the standard Major League Baseball players contract that says, we own you for this year, and we own you for next year too. And most players in those days did not have agents, right? And so when Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax, went in after and pulled a double holdout and went in there with a Hollywood agent, the general manager of the Dodgers freaked out because players just didn't have agents. So what tended to happen in baseball and all sports for that matter was at the end of a season, the player would go in to the general manager's office. The general manager would slide a contract across the desk and say, here's what I think you're worth. And sometimes they would say, take it or leave it, or sometimes a negotiation would take place. But certainly baseball players are not skilled negotiators, right? Are not skilled contract negotiators. And so that every year the player would sign a new deal, right? That says we own you for this year and we own you for next year too.
But,
right?
Brad, what leverage did the players have?
The only leverage in those days, great question, was to hold out, right? And that's what Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax did. I think before the 66 season, they pulled a double holdout. They were the ace pitchers for the Dodgers. And then that's what Curt did before the 1969 season. He wanted to be a $100,000 a year ball player, which in those days was superstar money. And he was holding out for 100. The Cardinals had just gone to the World Series. Curt, unfortunately, had dropped a fly ball at a crucial moment in Game 7. But he nonetheless thought he was on the cover in 68 as baseball's best center fielder. So he was at the top of his game, and he got 90 from that holdout. But what he did with that holdout was he really alienated the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals, Gushy Bush. There was a really paternalistic relationship between the owners and these players, and to hold out like that, I think broke whatever affection Gushy Bush had for Flood, and really kind of ruined his relationship with the team, and because he just really wasn't willing to go along with the program.
Brad Snyder. So these players would sign a contract to say, you're with this team for this year and we own your rights for next year. So there was no free agency. They didn't have much leverage. The only option they had would be to hold out and miss out on money. So this was the reserve clause, and this is how players essentially were owned by a team throughout the duration of their career?
Correct. 100% correct. And the problem is that when the team trades you to a different team, as you pointed out, Flood was traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies after the 69 season in October. And he went from the best team in the National League to the worst team in the National League. Then the Phillies owned Flood's rights in perpetuity. And Philadelphia was known at the time as a terrible place for African American ball players.
Yes.
Dick Allen had a horrible time in Philadelphia. Flood wrote in his autobiography, The Way It Is, that Philadelphia was the northernmost southern city. And he had a good friend on the team, Bill White, a first baseman.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill White said, "Don't come here. Right? This is a punishment. You get traded here. This is a punishment."
Wow.
Right? And Bill White's from Pennsylvania. Like, he knew what he was talking about. I'm from Ohio, but he lived his life in Pennsylvania, and so Flood knew that Philadelphia was the absolute worst place he could go.
So Curt Flood was a good ball player for a long time. He was a 3-time All-Star, 7-time Gold Glove winner. He was north of 300 for 6 seasons. So he played for the Cardinals, won championships there for over 10 years. And because maybe the ownership wasn't as fond of him anymore, they traded him. And he had no rights to where he would go. He never saw free agency in his first decade in the league. So here he is getting traded to Philadelphia, and he doesn't want to report.
Right.
He's heard that this is one of the worst cities. It's one of the worst teams. It's one of the worst cities for black ball players. He said, "I don't want to play in Philly." What was his course of action? What steps did he take to kind of resist this move?
Right. Two preliminary things. First of all, he was the longest tenured player on the Cardinals. He'd been with the Cardinals for 10 seasons. The guy I really analogize him to, particularly to Yankee fans,
yes,
is Bernie Williams.
Okay.
Right. He was like that he was not a super duper star,
right,
but he was that mainstay on the club. Right. So Flood's course of action is really either negotiate with Philadelphia, and Philadelphia, including some bonus money, was offering him a contract north of $100,000, or just sit out, or just quit, right? Or just or just not play.
Right.
Those were his two options. Go to Philadelphia, take their money, or don't play at all. Right. And Curt, instead of just choosing option A or option B, chose option C. He decided to sue Major League Baseball and challenge the reserve clause as a violation of the antitrust laws, and as baseball was basically running an illegal monopoly.
Wow.
Right. And so he went to 2 lawyers. First, he went to a St. Louis lawyer who was his personal lawyer, and that personal lawyer said, "We need to go see Marvin Miller." Marvin wasn't a lawyer. He was an economist, but he was the head of the Major League Baseball Players Association. Right. And Miller said to Flood when they met, he said, "This is $1 million to 1 shot, this lawsuit. And I'll explain why it was $1 million to 1 shot in a minute." He said, "And even if this $1 million to 1 shot comes home, you'll never see a dime."
Wow.
And Flood said, "Well, will this lawsuit benefit future players?" And Miller said it would. And Flood said, "That's good enough for me."
Wow, Brad, let me stop you right there. Curt Flood was one of the higher paid players in the league. And he was willing to take this sacrifice for the betterment of not only his peers, but future players.
Correct. And the reason why I wrote this book, A Well-Paid Slave, is to figure out why. Why would someone throw the career away?
Yeah.
Right? Why would someone, Flood could have played out the string, even if he only had 3 or 4 years left. He left at least $250,000 on the table. Why would somebody in a kind of altruistic fashion do something only to benefit others? And that's what I really kind of set out to kind of figure out.
What did his peers think of him going up against the reserve clause, the system that had been in place for baseball for over 50 years? What did they think?
This was a really shocking thing to me. There was not universal support among his fellow players. There was such a culture of fear, and there was such a power imbalance between the owners and the players. Curt Flood's best friend on the St. Louis Cardinals was their ace pitcher, Bob Gibson. Right? They were, they were best friends. And Gibson would not speak out in favor of Flood. He said, "Buddy, I'm behind you, but I'm 100 yards behind you." Because here's what Bob Gibson knew. Willie Mays got traded. Hank Aaron got traded. Frank Robinson got traded, right? These are all the black superstars in the game at the time. No one was untradeable in those days, particularly a star player late in his career. There were other players. This was really shocking to me. Harmon Killebrew of the Twins and Carl Yastrzemski of the Red Sox, they spoke out against Flood's lawsuit because they were so under the thumb and beholden to their respective owners, and they couldn't envision a life with free agency and what that would do for them. And they just thought, and Carl Yastrzemski said to me, I talked to him for the book, he said, Mr. Yawkey was good to me.
The owner of the Red Sox, yeah.
The owner of the Red Sox. Mr. Yawkey was good to me. Well, I didn't have a problem with the current system because I knew that Mr. Yawkey would take care of me.
Wow.
Right?
So people were comfortable in the current arrangement, which makes
Curt Flood afraid.
Other people were afraid, which makes Curt Flood's story even that more amazing. The sacrifice, and this is what I want to bring home to the audience. Like, Curt Flood was making some money. He was one of the higher paid players. So this truly, I guess, selfless and altruistic act is phenomenal. Phenomenal. His players, his peers, they were arguing against free agency. In 2022, that sounds crazy. That baseball players, athletes were arguing against free agency.
Yeah, and they just couldn't. It's hard to see the future, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to see like an alternate universe. And I'll tell you when the players started to see what Curt's visionary genius was all about. When Charlie Finley reached Catfish Hunter's contract in 1974, an independent arbitrator ruled that Catfish Hunter was a free agent, and then Catfish Hunter signed with the Yankees for $1.9 million. And that's when everybody realized, that's what we can get in free agency if we can negotiate with the team of our choice, right? And go to the highest bidder and not just with the team that owns us for life.
Curt Flood and Marvin Miller, who was heading the Players Association at that time, their case eventually got to the Supreme Court. What can you tell about the proceedings that happened at that level?
It was kind of a crazy Supreme Court argument, and the reason why it was 1,000,000 to 1 shot was because there were 2 Supreme Court cases that had already been decided, one in 1922 and one in 1953, that said baseball was exempt from the antitrust laws. And it's a complicated legal story, but basically Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1922 said baseball wasn't interstate commerce, that it was just a local operation, right? Each game was just a local operation, and he therefore said it didn't qualify under the antitrust laws, and the Supreme Court upheld that again in 1953 and said if Congress wants to change it, it's up to Congress. But baseball was the only professional sport and really the only business that was exempt from the antitrust laws, which was why it was going to be so hard to win.
So hard to win. Brad, what was baseball's argument to keep the reserve clause? Because we talked about some people being fearful, but there were some people that really believed the reserve clause was necessary. And if free agency was to happen, that would be the end of baseball. What was the argument for the reserve clause?
Right. The public line, right, to the American people was Curt Flood's trying to destroy the game of baseball, right? That this will be the end of baseball as we know it without the reserve clause. The owners were even saying that they would have to go back to barnstorming, that they would be unable to have, a 154 or 162 game schedule with free agency. But their legal argument was somewhat different. Their legal argument was this was a labor issue, like a collective bargaining issue between the union and management. This was not an antitrust issue, and we can be reasonable at the negotiating table. And they had to eventually put their money where their mouth was in that regard, because during Curt's trial in 1970, Marvin Miller was negotiating the 1970 basic agreement, and they got 2 really important concessions out of that collective bargaining agreement. One was they got an independent arbitrator to decide all grievances, which was huge. Right. In the past, the commissioner decided all the grievances, and he just works for the owners. We see that in the NFL, where Roger Goodell has the last word on grievances in the NFL to this day.
Yes.
Right. And it was that independent grievance procedure that allowed Catfish Hunter to become a free agent in 1974, and that allowed Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith to come to play out that option year, play without a contract for a year, and test the reserve clause as simply a one-year option and not a lifetime option, and allowed free agency to come into being. The second concession was equally important and still exists today. It's called the 10-5 rule, but at the time it was called the Curt Flood rule. It said if you have 10 years of major league service time and 5 with the same team, you can veto a trade. And there's still major league players to this day, veterans at the trade deadline, that veto trades. Yes. And that's because of Curt Flood's lawsuit.
Amazing. With the Supreme Court case, no active players would come out and speak on behalf of Curt Flood. But he was able to get a retired player to come and speak on his behalf, the great Jackie Robinson.
Yeah. To me, that was the highlight of my whole book, right? So there was a trial in federal district court in Lower Manhattan, and all these former players and owners spoke out in favor of the reserve clause, and only 3 people testified on Curt Flood's behalf besides Marvin Miller. One was a former player and general manager and owner, Hank Greenberg. 2 was another former owner, Bill Veck, who was great on both race and labor. And 3rd was Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson was Curt's hero. In 1962, Robinson had since retired from the game. He invited Curt to speak at an NAACP rally in Jackson, Mississippi. They were surveilled by the state secret police. Their host was Medgar Evers, who 7 months later was shot and killed. Robinson was Curt's idol, and Curt really, during the trial in 1970, was distraught. He was sitting out the Major League Baseball season. He had personal problems. He had financial problems. He had no money coming in.
It took a toll on him. Challenging the system took a toll on him personally, financially.
No doubt. And Robinson, by this point, had diabetes. He had a cane. He was partially blind. He walked down that center aisle. He stopped, and he whispered in Curt's ears, "Keep your head up. You're doing the right thing." And that gave Curt the boost he needed to see this through to the end. That his hero, Jackie Robinson, not only would tell him to keep his spirits up, but then would take the witness stand and say, there is no need for the reserve clause. I just want to make one other point about Jackie Robinson, because I think he's the most fascinating person in sports history. The Dodgers thanked Jackie Robinson for his service at the end of his career by trading him to their arch rivals, the New York Giants, right? So even the great Jackie Robinson was sold like a piece of property at the end of his career. And that really hurt Robinson. And rather than report to the Giants, he retired.
He retired. Jackie Robinson played out his career under the reserve clause, correct?
No doubt, yes.
And when they went to kind of prep Jackie Robinson to take the stand, Marvin Miller and the team, there was one hurdle, because in 1958, wasn't Jackie Robinson on record as supporting the reserve clause?
You've done your homework. Yes, he was, right? Jackie Robinson had testified before Congress that they should have a reserve clause. But I think between 1958 and 1970, Jackie Robinson realized that Branch Rickey had really, I think, deceived him about the need for a reserve clause, and his eyes opened up. And I think Robinson was also hurt. Major League Baseball never hired Jackie Robinson after his playing career. He was always on the outside looking in. And I think that as time went on, Robinson began to see the inequities between the players and the owners, and to feel those really deeply on somebody who was really kept at bay from the game. It's hard for people to understand today, where we have Jackie Robinson Day and everybody celebrates him like They celebrate Dr. King in a few days. But in those days, Major League Baseball wanted nothing to do with Jackie Robinson after his playing career.
After his playing career was up, he couldn't get a managerial position. He couldn't get a general manager position.
No, he went and worked for Mr. Coffee, right? Like
Yeah.
he went and worked as a businessman in private business because he was deemed as too much of an independent thinker to be in the game of baseball, right? He refused to be a yes man, right, for the owners. He was such an iconoclast, Robinson was, and really outspoken and really fearless. And that's what really, I think his testimony at Curt Flood's lawsuit reiterates that. Just that fearlessness and willingness to go against the grain. That epitomized Robinson's whole career, and Flood's too, for that matter. I mean, I wrote that he's the next generation's Jackie Robinson.
For sure. And that's
that Robinson brought us racial equality and Flood brought economic freedom to the players.
Wow. And that's why I love reading my history. You said I did my homework. I really read this book,
I can tell.
Like you said, it's amazing that the league celebrates Jackie Robinson Day. The 42 is retired throughout the sport. But in his post-playing days, he couldn't get an opportunity in baseball. And I think that's important to know. Curt Flood, Marvin Miller, head of the baseball union, they had their case heard at the Supreme Court, but they lost.
They lost. It was unbelievably bad, right? It was an unbelievably bad situation. They had hired Miller when he was working for the Steelworkers Union, worked with the general counsel there, a man named Arthur Goldberg, who became John F. Kennedy's Secretary of Labor, and then who Kennedy named to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1962. And Goldberg retired from the Supreme Court in 65, or he left to go be the head of the United Nations to try to end the Vietnam War for Lyndon Johnson. And Goldberg, Marvin Miller thought, oh, I've got a former Supreme Court justice argue on my behalf. This is going to be a definite winner. And instead, the opposite happened. Like, Goldberg was past his prime as a lawyer. I analogize him to like Willie Mays stumbling in the outfield for the New York Mets late in his career. He got up in front of his former colleagues of the court and he had stage fright. Wow. And he couldn't get into Flood's legal argument, which was actually quite sophisticated. And he never really got Flood's best arguments out on the table before his former colleagues. And then the court was really closely divided. A lot of times oral argument doesn't matter. The judges have made up their minds based on the briefs, right? Which is, logical, right? But this was a really close case. The justices were very evenly divided. And in fact, several justices switched votes after oral argument, switched sides. Thurgood Marshall was on the side of Major League Baseball at first, and then he switched to Flood, and then other people switched from Flood to Major League Baseball, and eventually Flood lost 5-3, but it was deadlocked 4-4 for several months at the court after his oral argument.
Curt Flood had a former Supreme Court justice on his team, and he went up there and he had stage fright. He dropped the ball.
He did.
And go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately it's like they got the biggest name they could find to argue for Flood, and sometimes you don't need the biggest name, you need the best lawyer. And the lawyer for MLB did a really good job, but Flood's lawyer choked that day.
Thurgood Marshall was on that Supreme Court also. Wow.
Yes.
I didn't remember that. So he loses the case. What is the reaction around baseball? What is the reaction around his fellow players? And many people may not know, after challenging baseball, Curt Flood actually returned to the sport, playing for the Washington Senators?
Well, yeah, one of the problems with his litigation was his lawyers had allowed him in 1971, after he sat out the 1970 season, right? He refused to go to Philadelphia to play for the Senators. He lasted only a couple weeks, right? Because the time off and his personal problems just had taken a toll on him physically. But I think that ruined his lawsuit more than anything else. Going back to the Senators really hurt his cause. I'll tell you why. I'll analogize him to somebody who's an obvious analogy. There is so much sympathy for Colin Kaepernick, right, who sacrificed his entire career for kneeling and standing up for Black Lives Matter and against police brutality, and was blackballed by the NFL. I think if Curt had sat out all of the 1970 season and all of the 1971 season and all of the half of the 1972 season until the Supreme Court decided his case, he would have won. But there was a sense among the justices, what are we doing here? Curt got to play for the team of his choice. He did come back with the Senators, and he left the game, right? There's no real controversy here, and I think Curt became kind of less sympathetic
because he returned to the sport.
Because he returned to the Senators.
He returned to the
sport.
sport.
Words, no case or controversy. Like, what's the harm here, right? He's not blackballed like Colin Kaepernick. Right. He got a different opportunity and it didn't work out for him. And that has nothing to do with the reserve clause.
So hold on, Brad. He returned to the sport of baseball before the ruling came down with the Supreme Court. Wow. That would hurt his case. Yeah.
That hurt his case. And his lawyers had MLB sign an agreement saying this doesn't moot his case. This doesn't make his case irrelevant. But that was really another error by Arthur Goldberg, as big as the one at oral argument. He should have advised Curt, hey, if you want to be the most sympathetic plaintiff in front of the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, you need to keep sitting out because this is, he's signed for the Washington Senators for $110,000, right? That doesn't make him look sympathetic. And there's hard to see how he was harmed by the reserve clause at that point.
Real quick, how did he get from the Phillies to the Senators?
Well, I think the Phillies, that's a great question. The Phillies relinquished his rights and sold his rights to the Senators once they knew that Flood wasn't going to report. And I think Major League Baseball really urged the Phillies to give his rights to the Senators because they wanted Curt back in the game to try to make his lawsuit irrelevant.
Right. So when he went to the Senators, he was out of shape. He just wasn't the player he was anymore, mentally, physically. So eventually his career came to an end after a few weeks with the Senators. What were those years like after baseball? Because he lost his Supreme Court, but eventually free agency would take place after Curt Flood was already retired.
Right.
What was that like for him when free agency did come to pass?
So those are two different questions, and let me take the first one about what happened to him afterwards. Flood left the Senators in 1971 and exiled himself first to Denmark, but in 1970, and then he came back to the Senators from Denmark. But then from the Senators, he left for Majorca, Spain, which is an island off the coast of Spain.
Right.
And he really he was a functioning alcoholic for a lot of years. And I think like a lot of baseball players were, right? If you look at Mickey Mantle and others, right, they were functioning alcoholics. And you take away baseball from Curt and he becomes a non-functioning alcoholic, right? And I think alcoholism took its toll. He didn't have any money and he became pretty destitute. And he came back to Oakland, his hometown, in 1976 in really bad shape. In really bad shape. The American consulate in Spain eventually had to get him out of Europe and back home because he had no money. And so this was a really dark time for him. And he fought a battle against alcoholism, which we all know is disease, and a tough disease. And it took him about 10 years to conquer alcoholism. But I would say this about, Catfish Hunter becomes a free agent 2 years after Curt's lawsuit because of the things Curt fought for. Messersmith McNally 3 years after Curt's lawsuit. And then the floodgates opened, no pun intended. And lots of guys became free agents because of the 1976 collective bargaining agreement. But Flood was not bitter about those guys. He was not bitter at all. In fact, he was very supportive about the $1 million contracts, multi-million-dollar contracts these players were getting.
Wow.
He like when Roger Clemens signed a deal, Flood was happy for Roger Clemens, right? He said actors make $1 million a picture or $5 million a picture. Why can't ball players make $1 million a year or $5 million a year. He never was resentful that he never got a dime from his lawsuit and that other players made millions from free agency. He thought that the more freedom, the more power, and the more money players had, the better. And I've said this in a lot of different places, but I think like what would have made Flood thrilled was to see LeBron James on national television say, with the Decision Show on ESPN, right? I'm taking my talents to South Beach, right? That's the culmination of everything Flood was fighting for, right? That to take away, to balance out the power between the owners and the players, and to really, the players are the ones that the fans are coming to see.
For sure.
And I think LeBron James's Decision Show was really the culmination of everything that Curt fought for.
Yeah, for sure. Curt Flood died in what, 97?
Yeah, he died of throat cancer in January of 97. And he really got a lot of accolades, I'd say. It's not,
I was going to ask, did baseball ever embrace him? Did he ever get to see and feel that love from the sport after free agency became rampant?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the question, when you say baseball, I'll tell you who embraced him, right? During the 1994 baseball strike, the players invited him to speak at one of their meetings in Atlanta, and he was given a huge standing ovation by the players at that meeting in Atlanta in 94. He was also featured in Ken Burns' baseball documentary, and you can go back and watch it. Curt's an incredibly eloquent and smart guy, and you should listen to him talk about his lawsuit. And that really revived a lot of interest in Curt Flood, that baseball documentary. And then President and Mrs. Clinton invited all of the talking heads and the people in the documentary to the White House, and he got to meet President and Mrs. Clinton. So the short answer is yes, he got his due from some segments of the baseball world, but in other ways he didn't. In other ways, the union never got Flood a job. He never got a job in Major League Baseball after a brief stint announcing with the A's in 76. There was a senior baseball league that was started, and he was the commissioner of it. But I think Curt saw himself much like his idol Jackie Robinson on the outside of the game looking in. But Marvin Miller had warned him that was going to happen.
Yes.
He said, not only is this 1,000,000-to-1 shot and you'll never see a dime, but you'll never get a job in the game again, right? These sports leagues don't like freedom fighters. They don't like individuals who want to take on the establishment. Those people tend to pay a price, as we saw with Colin Kaepernick, as we saw with Muhammad Ali, as we saw with Tommy Smith, and John Carlos.
Yes, a big price.
Yeah, those people pay a price for their activism.
Brad, you mentioned that this was truly a selfless act on the part of Curt Flood, and you set out to figure out why, with someone who was one of the higher paid players in the game, why would you jeopardize your career? Why would you challenge the reserve clause when everybody was just content and staying pat? Why did he make that decision?
Yeah, the short answer is the civil rights movement. I think there's a sense of people in the history, who think about the history of baseball, that after Jackie Robinson integrated the National League, and after Larry Doby integrated the American League, that everything was easy for African-American players, in the succeeding generation, that next generation, that Joshua generation, if you will. And those players had it really hard. And I think Curt experienced some of the worst aspects of the civil rights movement. He's an 18-year-old kid from Oakland, California, who was on an American Legion team with black people and white people and Asian people. He goes to spring training in Florida with the Cincinnati Reds in Tampa, Florida. He shows up at the hotel. It's an all-white hotel, and he's immediately shuffled off into a cab for black people and into the black section of town at a boarding house where he finds all of the team's black players, because that's where he has to stay in those days. Wow. It just gets worse from there. He's sent to the Carolina League in 1956 in High Point and Thomasville, and he experiences the worst Southern style segregation possible. He's not allowed to eat with his teammates. He's not allowed to even shower or put his own laundry in with his teammates. Laundry. And he's the Carolina League Player of the Year. He wants to go home after a couple of weeks in the Carolina League, and not being able to go to the bathroom at a rest stop, with his teammates, or not being able to eat in the restaurant with his teammates. Next year's even worse in the South Atlantic League, known as the Sally League in Savannah. Right, he has a horrible year there. It's even the deeper South than North Carolina is. Gets traded by the Reds to the Cardinals after that season. Struggles with the Cardinals to find his footing as a really racist manager, Saul Hemus. And even though he's not a full-time player in the early 60s, he and a few other black players say it's ridiculous that we still have to go to spring training in St. Petersburg, Florida, and stay in a black boarding house, and we can't stay in the hotel with the other players. The Cardinals ownership, to their credit, buys the hotel and integrates it by buying it. And so that's 61. 62, as I mentioned before, he goes to Mississippi with Jackie Robinson, which was a huge eye-opener, and showed Flood that he could be not just a ball player fighting about segregated spring training facilities, but also the larger freedom struggle. Right. And then in 1964, after the Cardinals have won the World Series against the Yankees, Flood and his wife try to rent a home in a neighborhood in Walnut Creek, California. Right. This is in liberal San Francisco, right? In Walnut Creek, and someone threatens him with a shotgun. If he moves into that house. He gets armed police protection and a court order, and they move into that house on live television. And Curt, he's got a pregnant wife at the time. They're moving, and Curt, the camera's rolling, is talking to the local news about why he felt that he just had to stand up for his rights, and that the law was on his side. So to me, right, if you look at everything he experienced from High Point to Savannah to Mississippi to Walnut Creek, it's obvious why he challenges the reserve clause, after he gets traded in 1969. This is someone who spent his life standing up to injustice throughout his career, right? He was not just willing to go along and get along. And so I just think the civil rights movement and really the racism and discrimination he experienced in that next generation after Jackie Robinson made him super sensitive to injustice. And he saw the reserve clause as an injustice, right? He told Howard Cosell, a well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave, right? And that really lit this lawsuit on fire in a lot of ways and turned a lot of people against him. I'm saying, how can a black ball player making close to $100,000 a year call himself a slave, right? There was a lot of racism even during his lawsuit directed Curt's way.
Wow. Brad, I've heard authors describe these books as like labor, giving birth. You got to do a lot of research. Like 9 months, the child is being baked in the oven. Like it's hard work. And what's evident from you is your passion, even as you speak about this. So I want to ask you, like, why did you decide to take on this project? Some would say this is Black history. This is like, why did you choose to tell this story?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I quit my job at a law firm to write this book. And the lawyers I was working for said, "You're crazy. Like, why are you quitting your job to do this?" I said, "I have to tell this story, right? I needed to tell this story." Curt is a tremendous story of one man taking on the establishment, right? And I just, and one man taking on the establishment, not for his own good, but for other people's best interests, and that kind of story it lit a fire under me, and I don't look at it as Black history. I look at it as American history, and I was embarrassed when I was a sports writer at the Baltimore Sun in 1994, and the baseball strike hit, that I knew almost nothing about Curt Flood. I was covering the game of baseball, and I didn't know the story. And if I didn't know the story, and I was supposed to be writing about it for a living, in '94 that I would guess a lot of other people didn't know the story either. And I just thought the world needed to know what Curt Flood had done. He made baseball a better game. He made all of professional sports better, and he made America better. And he paid a huge price for that, but he thought that price was worth it.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, you did a great job, man. I'm so thankful for authors like you who take on the project of telling these great stories, so they will forever live on and not be forgotten.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate it. William, I appreciate your passion for learning the history of the game and learning the history of the country, and the depth of your knowledge about Jackie Robinson and Curt Flood, and we need to keep educating people about Curt Flood. I was amazed when the Yankees ace pitcher signs his $300 million contract, and who's the first person he thanks after signing a $324 million contract? He thanks Curt Flood.
He thanked Curt Flood, Brad Snyder. I was floored. Last year, Garrett Cole, pitcher for the Yankees, when he's up there with his family, he's getting generational wealth. He thanks Curt Flood. What was that like for you, the author of A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports?
I got chills, right? I got chills. Like, you watch that on ESPN, and I just got chills seeing that. Like, here's a pitcher, a white guy who, you wouldn't think would know the game, and bless the catcher on the Pirates, who, the backstory of that is when Garrett Cole was coming up with the Pirates, a catcher on the team made him write a book report about Curt Flood. And so that's how, and this is what the players have to do, right? The older players have to educate the younger players about how they got to where they are, how they were able to achieve generational wealth. And the reason why are people like Jackie Robinson, people like Curt Flood, people like Catfish Hunter, right, who fought for their rights and stood up for them. And I can't remember the name of the catcher on the Pirates, that his first name is John. The last name eludes me. But it's amazing that not to hate. I know there's a amount of hazing that goes on among veteran players in locker rooms, but rather than haze a guy, to have him write a book report about Curt Flood and about the history of the game, I just thought that was amazing.
Yeah, big time, big time. When I was trying to find a contact for you, I saw your scholarship, and this is not the only book that you have written. Please tell us about the book on the Homestead Grays, please. What's the title? That's next on my list, by the way, Brad.
Well, I appreciate that. That's the first book I wrote. That was my honors thesis in college. I wrote a book about the Homestead Grays called Beyond the Shadow of the Senators. And the Homestead Grays were one of the two greatest teams in the history of the Negro Leagues. And during the war, really starting in 1940, they're based out of Pittsburgh, right? The team started as a steel mill team, but Pittsburgh was not on the rail line, and there was gas rationing during the war. And so the Grays started playing their home games in Washington, D.C. And the book's really a story is about how this great black middle class of Washington, D.C. and really working class black people in Washington, D.C. Embraced this ball club. And they had the best team in the Negro National League. And the irony is the Washington Senators were the worst team, right? First in war, first in peace, and last in the American League is what people called the Washington Senators. So you had in the same stadium, in Griffith Stadium, you had the best all-black team and the worst white team. In the same stadium. And, Josh Gibson was the home run hitting catcher, and Buck Leonard was the future Hall of Fame first baseman, and Ray Brown was a Hall of Fame pitcher, and Satchel Paige would come to town with the Kansas City Monarchs, and they would fill Griffith Stadium, which in those days only held up to 27,000 people. One night they had 32,000 people in Griffith Stadium, just 5 more than capacity. Right. When Satchel Paige came, they roped off areas. Right. It was a huge deal. And, these guys should have been in the major leagues. And I say this all the time, all the stats before 47 are illegitimate, right? Because half the talent wasn't allowed to play.
Right. And with the Homestead Grays, there was a movement to try to get the whole team integrated into MLB?
Yes. Bill Veeck, again, who testified at Curt's trial, in 1943, he wanted to buy the Philadelphia Phillies and then take a whole team of black players into MLB with the Phillies, and MLB caught wind of it, and they wouldn't let Veeck buy the Phillies in order to do that. But Satchel Paige said, yeah, let's have a team of black players in there. They would have crushed any team in the major leagues with Paige pitching and Gibson catching and Buck Leonard playing first base and Cool Papa Bell in the outfield. And those guys, Cool Papa Bell was on the Grays as well. I mean, it's just again, like Flood, a story that most baseball fans just don't know.
Yeah. Brad Snyder, I really enjoyed your book. I really appreciate you joining us here on the podcast, and I appreciate your passion for the history.
Well, William, I really appreciate being there. I'd love to come back, so definitely have me back.
All right, we'll do it. All right, take care, man. Ladies and gentlemen, at the WBH Radio, we're out of here.